Thank you, Becky, and welcome everyone for joining the webinar. We know it's probably late for some people in some parts of the world, but it's also we needed to find an hour that works for pretty much a number of people who are presenting. And so thank you for making time to join us. Uh, Teresa, if you could bring up the slides, I'll be very brief because really mine is just to welcome you and to introduce the webinar. As Becky said, it's a two-part series, and last week we did the first webinar that was mainly focused on the process of application, eligibility, who can apply, budget, how you submit those, and the whole application process. So really, today's webinar is mainly focused on technical aspects of prevention and also the research elements that we will be looking at infusing into this project that will be selected. And so really, if you have any questions that relate to any process for application that we did last week, we will post the email where you can send those because we want to maintain the focus of this webinar and for the participants to interact with the presenters on really the issues around the research and elements of VAL programming, successful VAL programming. So really, yeah, that's all I wanted to say. And then the second slide, please move to the second slide, Teresa. Teresa, are we able to move the slides? As Teresa is doing that, we will have two presenters, one from the implementation consortium and the other one from the research consortium. And yeah, and really, so as I said, those are the two components we will cover today. And so the program is implemented, next slide please, by two large consortia that will be presenting to you today. One is led by the Global Women's Institute at the George Washington University, and the partners on that right of the page are indicated. And the other one is led by the International Rescue Committee with those five partners on the page. We spoke about this last week, and so this was just by way of introduction. I will ask Tina and Shanaz, who are our two presenters today, to introduce themselves when they start their presentations. And I will now hand it over to you, Tina.
Thank you very much, Anne, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, colleagues who are online. My name is Tina Musuya. Sorry, let me switch on my camera. My name is Tina Musuya. I'm a colleague for the Learning Partnerships team, and today I'll be talking you through what effective violence prevention programming is all about. So very quickly, violence prevention is about stopping violence from occurring or reoccurring. And also it's about addressing the causes or risk factors of violence at a community level. So violence prevention programming is not just about stopping an incident, it's about creating that change and addressing the causes or the risk factors within the ecosystem. Next slide, please. So I will quickly talk you through the prevention to response continuum. As you see that particular slide, prevention is stopping violence before it occurs, and it happens at different in different ways. There's what we call the targeted prevention, which is aimed at specific groups or individuals who we may be considering high risk, maybe a couple that is the couple interventions, and we are selecting people who are really directly experiencing violence, or if it's economic empowerment, the ones who are struggling economically, and then we target that particular group. And then there is the universal prevention, which is aimed at entire community population. It takes a whole community approach to shift all those causes and risk factors as we've been talking. And then, of course, within this, there's the response, which is about addressing survivor needs and treating mental and physical consequences of violence. So it's prevention to response continuum. That's like a whole package altogether. Next slide, please. So I will quickly talk to you what we already know about violence against women and children. As you may know, intimate partners are by far the most common perpetrators of violence against adolescent and adult women. Also, harsh discipline in the family is the most common form of violence against children, and also exploring exposure to violence. Teresa, can you just widen the slide, please, so I can see it properly? So, sorry about that. Exposure to violence in children increases risk of experiencing and perpetrating violence in adulthood, and also sexual assault or abuse of children is reported more frequently to authorities than any other form of violence. Um, then also, um, sec- most sexual abuse of children under 15 is perpetrated by extended family members, neighbors, or acquaintances, not strangers. And sites of violence against women and girls include private and public spaces, such as relationships, homes, schools, public spaces, workplaces, and online. Next slide, please. What we do know about mitigation and response: less than 10% to 15% of women in most settings seek help from a formal authority or service provider, and women almost universally seek help first from family or friends. How these first line responders react is very critical. If they are blaming, then we know it's not going to be supportive to the women. If they are supportive, then it also encourages people to speak up. Many victims and families do not trust the police or judicial system to deliver justice. They prefer informal, traditional strategies for resolving disputes. And the culture of silence and victim blaming undermines effective response at all levels. Sexual violence is marked by deep shame and stigma in many communities. Next slide, please. So let's look through the norms and beliefs that sustain violence. First of all, there's a lot acceptance of male authority and female submission in the family is a key norm that drives the violence within homes and communities, and norms and beliefs around men's and women's roles, responsibilities, and entitlements. You know, those rigid gender roles, especially within our settings here in Africa, if I'm to use that example, gives that entitlement for the men to be like the dominant folks within those relationships and homes, and acceptance of violence as an acceptable, necessary form of discipline or correction. I'm sure some of you have had um, certain thinking or stereotypes that marriage is not a bed of roses. It is like creating that acceptability of violence in relationships, and then a culture of silence where family reputation is prioritized over well-being of abused women or children. Norms of family privacy. You know, they always speak of don't wash the dirty linen in public, and it's like really keeping issues of violence as private. Norms and beliefs around sexuality, female purity, and family honor. All these norms really sustain the violence within the communities. Next slide, please. I will quickly talk us through learning from implementation. Violence against women prevention is possible when programming is deep and sustained. I'm sure you've heard the phrase violence is preventable. It also requires being personal and provocative because most people come to this place with the norms and belief system that they've had from where they were raised or where they live. It's important that the work also starts with transforming the people who are leading this work. And when we talk of provocative, it's about, putting us into that uncomfortable state to start looking at violence as problematic. NGOs support, backstop, and provide materials and mentorship, but it is all the effective work needs to be led by the women and men and the youth within that particular community and their leaders. Also seeking to transform long-held beliefs, and in this case, the patriarchal system requires engaging across the ecological model. It's not effective to just deal with one group. We need to transform across the ecological model. Also, creating an enabling environment for gender equitable, collaborative, and inclusive work through instituting staff or partner collective care policies and practices, and so that also effective safeguarding and accountability. The component of accountability and safeguarding is very critical here. We need to have these mechanisms for staff, partners, and community members, and also nurturing a culture of collective and continuous learning to create critical reflection, including documentation of practice based knowledge and learning, is very effective because that is used to again strengthen programming. Formalizing change is essential to sustain change. Once you've implemented an effective program, it's important to work out with that particular group how that change is going to be formalized for it to be sustained way beyond the project. Next slide, please. So, when we are talking of prevention, we need to be looking at what the community level or prevention goals are going to look like, because we need to be changing the status quo to be able to have a better ecosystem that does not tolerate violence. So we need to be working towards girls and women aspiring to and can envision a more positive future. If they do that, then they also have their agency to be part of this activism and change. People come to see, we need to, the other goal is people need to come to see violence in the family as harmful and unnecessary and wrong. That's when they will not tolerate it, because now, right now, many people still think it's normal and acceptable. Now we need to flip that around. People need to recognize that cultural and gender norms are created and can change. Gender norms, they are positive ones and negative ones. The good thing is norms can be created, and therefore they shouldn't be rigid and stick to certain harmful norms. Family and community members to provide appropriate emotional and material support if women or children disclose abuse. Remember, we talked of most survivors usually run fast to family members and friends and neighbors. So the people that they contact first need to be providing appropriate emotional and material support for us to break that cycle of violence and prevent violence. Community and faith leaders help break the silence and model non-victim blaming behavior. Once they do this repeatedly, then we shall be seeing a lot of change. Institutional actors meet their ethical and professional obligations to enhance safety and provide appropriate support. If we do have those goals met, or they are the ones guiding the work that we are doing, we shall be able to have very effective programs out there. Next slide, please. So, as over the years and all the efforts of key actors, including yourselves, we've come to learn about things that do not prevent or reduce violence. And these include the following. If the work focuses exclusively on awareness raising or sensitization activities, this is not going to transform the community. It's not going to prevent violence because people will be aware or they will know something, but they will not have the skill to apply that knowledge. Also, once of workshops or trainings or distribution of economic of eh, information and education and communication materials does not create that change that we are looking for. Improving quality of formal services is important, but does not lead to prevention. Because remember, it's handling individual people who seek services, but they are coming from a broader community that tolerates or might even prevent them from seeking these services. Also, increasing arrests or severity of criminal penalties does not reduce or end the violence. Also, police training and sensitization alone does not, women's economic empowerment alone is not sufficient, because if the gender issues are not addressed at the relationship level, that economic empowerment may end up being a double-edged sword for the women alone who are receiving that money. Rehabilitating perpetrators is not showing any evidence on effectiveness. Also, working with only men or only women does and harmful or threatening messages. If your programming is going out there to threaten the participants, they will just go silent and and be under. The violence will continue to happen from under. It will not, and they will tell you lies about what has changed. Yet in reality, there's no change. Next slide, please. So let's quickly run through elements of success. This I'm speaking to you about the ingredients of success according to the evidence. So there is need to have sufficient length for the programming. Remember, we are addressing centuries old behaviors and transforming norms that have been around for a very long time, that have turned into almost very concrete belief systems. So this the length of the program needs to be sufficient. For example, for groups, at least 12 sessions if you're working with couples or whatever, adolescents or whatever groups you're working with. And if you're working for community level activities, evidence shows that 3 years plus, because you're working with a big group and you need to be consistent in your work. Also, clarity on the behavior, attitudes, and norms to be targeted. Do not just go randomly talking about all norms, beliefs, and that will be too random. You need to be, there needs to be clarity so that you concentrate on the ones that you've identified for your particular program. Also, consistent content delivered to multiple overlapping community members is extremely important. And that's why also having like a particular approach or module that is guiding your intervention is very important. Also being aspirational focusing on the benefits of change rather than threatening, because when people see possibilities and they are looking at what the change will look like, they become inspired to create the change. Integrating analysis of gender and power. Remember, we are working to address the patriarchal system and the whole gender inequality. So this is very important. The work that has to be participatory but structured. So use of curricula and experiential learning is extremely important. Selection and skill of staff and facilitators or volunteers, whatever you call them, this people do not get these skills from university. Once they might be really qualified police officers or leaders or whatever, but ground them on the values and the content and the language and enable them to be the key facilitators of change within that particular community. They need to know how to push back and how to get a community to, or a group that they are working with, to a critical reflection process. Um, we also need the work that has to be done has to have high exposure rather than random, must engage overlapping constituencies multiple times. Next slide, please. So, elements of success for curriculum based programming, as we've already spoken, at least 12 to 15 sessions if you're working with a given group. Also, written implementation manuals with clear scripts and exercises are very good because this will ensure that even when you're translating, for example, or scaling or taking it to a new community, the content, the actual messages that you would like the communities to learn from remain intact. And these manuals need to be having a clear theory of change because this gives clarity of purpose and process, clear implementation plan, including how you will track progress and budget for your violence prevention programming. Emphasis on gender transformative change and skills building is very important. And some of the skills are, of course, communication, negotiation, conflict management, building intimacy. These are important skills. And all these, the work needs to give that opportunity to practice. If someone went out there to just preach or speak, people will listen and be happy about how well you presented, and that will remain with you who took the program there. But if you give them some exercises or practice, then they can go back to practice how this change will look like for them because every individual will create their pathway to change, but towards a shared goal and value. Next slide, please. Also engaging diverse groups of women and men. It's good. Every group in every community, there's a lot of diversity. Minorities in there, including women and girls with disability or people with disability, sexual minorities, poor people, all these, the intervention needs to be mindful of the various groups within a given context that the program is reaching. Also, close alignment between outcomes sought and content of sessions so that the work is aligned to the program outcomes. If the content of the approach is towards that particular outcome, then you'll be able to effect the changes that you would like to create. Training and selection of staff and community facilitators, and also follow-ups, supervision, mentoring, and support is very, very important to ground the key people leading this program on the approach, and also to have components of collective and self-care infused within that mentoring support. They stay encouraged and able to continue with the process of change. Next slide, please. Let me quickly talk you through what we mean by innovation, because you are applying for innovation grants. The definition, as we in the What Works too, is the development and implementation of new or existing ideas with a transformative ability to contribute impact with potential for future scaling. And this innovation should be able to address drivers of violence that have previously been underexplored or approaches to combat violence in populations or settings or sectors where little experience or rigorous evidence exists. So that's innovation because we are going to new frontiers that we haven't been. Next slide, please. And for the window two, these are the thematic areas that we are looking at. Of course, prevention of violence against women and girls in fragile and conflict affected settings. Colleagues who are based in the MENA region are encouraged to apply for these grants as well. Also, technology facilitated gender based violence is another thematic area that we are really interested in, and also addressing violence against women and girls prevention in climate change programming of settings. These are areas that the areas that window two is really interested in. Next slide, please. Yes, I will stop it here. I don't know whether we are taking questions now or
No, Tina, we will have the next presentation and then we
okay.
have 30 minutes at the end for questions. So,
Okay.
yeah, we will be inviting Shanaz now to take us through the next round of presentation.
Over to you, Shana.
Thank you,
Yeah, it's
Anne and Tina. Teresa, are you going to display the slides or are you going to? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Shanaz Matthews, and I'm the evaluation co-lead for the What Works Research Consortium. Because we didn't present last week, what I thought I would do was probably to just introduce the research consortium to you. Maybe we can go to the next slide. And I think Anne did mention this at the beginning. Oh, okay. So I have my slides out of order. That's me. So just to say that Tina, and building on from the presentation last week, so leave it. It's fine, Teresa. I'll wing it. Not to
Thank you.
worry.
Sorry, this is the latest presentation I
Yeah,
do have.
it's absolutely okay. Just to say that, you know, and I want to stress that all applications, once they successfully awarded a grant, they will be paired with a research partner from the research consortium. And I think that's very important because sometimes there's a misunderstanding and some applications come in and we see that you actually think that the research has to be done within the same grant. But what you are applying for is an application, is a grant for implementation of an innovative prevention idea. The research consortium comes in to partner with you to develop a research proposal that go hand in hand to best evaluate the program that you're presenting in your research proposal. So what we will come in to do as the research consortium is to work with you to co-design a fit for purpose research project where we will be thinking about the research questions, and I'll delve more into that little bit more. And this will be done with you as the implementing partner, and we will work with you to start looking at what is the learning and evidence that you propose through your innovative project to surface and whereby we can learn. And I think that's really important because if you look at and just to reflect on the purpose of the What Works 2 program, it is around building an evidence base on what works to prevent violence against women and girls in low and middle income settings. And that's really important because Tina spoke about what do we know about the evidence, what's the best elements for projects that we know works. And through the What Works 1 program, our predecessor, what that particular program of work showed is that preventing violence is possible. So we do know that in between 2 to 3 years, a number of the projects that was evaluated through What Works 1 showed us that as much as 50% of violence violence against women and girls can be prevented in a very short space of time. So for us, it's really important through this particular program that we also build in an evidence building component to then, through this program, to then establish what can work and how your innovative ideas, whether it is possible to prevent violence. Next slide, please, Teresa. So who are we? As Anne had said, the research consortium is led by the Global Women's Institute at George Washington University, and the core partners are Aga Khan University in Pakistan, the Equality Institute in Australia, Johns Hopkins University in the US, Kenyatta University, the Women's Economic Empowerment Hub, and then University of Cape Town in South Africa, where I'm based. Besides that, we have more than 25 resource partners and about 30 individual resource partners across the Global South who are joining us as research partners in particular contexts. And what's really important to understand, depending on where projects are located, we try and always find an in-country partner who can either take the lead or partner with us to lead on the work in country to develop the evidence base, because it's really critical that we also have researchers that understand the context that we're working with in the country. So that's really, really critical for us. Next slide, Teresa. So the research engagement process is really important because it has to be a consultative and collaborative process, because we don't come in as consultants to do the research. We come in as partners in the project. And early on in the research, in the whole project phase of the project, what we plan to do is to work with the implementation consortium, and we call it a co-design process where we work with the implementing partners to then start thinking about the project as you're proposing it. Is it possible to evaluate the project as you've proposed it in terms of the theory of change? And therefore, your theory of change is incredibly important. We start thinking, and in your proposal that you're going to, concept note that you're presenting now, you're already starting to think about the research questions that you have, or the learning questions that you have. And what's critical here, and Tina spoke about, that you either, the innovation proposal you're presenting will either be a new idea, completely new idea, or it's building on existing ideas. And in your proposal, it's really good to surface what is already known about the particular innovation that you're proposing. What are you adding that's new to it? And therefore, what would potentially be the learning questions that you are proposing for this particular project. So in the short concept that you already presenting, you can start thinking about what are some of those learning questions that will be redefined and sharpened through a co-design process with the research consortium, and where you can input into that process. The design of methods of what we're going to use as an evaluation method is really, and I'll talk a little bit more. Some of you understand research very well, have conducted research. For others on this call today, research might be a very scary business, and it's not always great to have an evaluation conducted on your work, but you've got to remember that in this partnership, we see it as a partnership where we want to work together so that it doesn't become an outside experience, but that you're part of that evaluation process as well. And therefore, the decision on design of the methods for the evaluation, it has to be fit for purpose. So it has to be able to answer the question that you have and that you land on. And it also has to be contextually relevant and feasible. So for instance, in a conflict setting, you might not be able to do a randomized control trial because it's just far too difficult to do randomization, for instance. And therefore, we have to take context into account. Teresa, can we move on to the next slide? Therefore, the first step in any research project is critical. What do you want to know? And this is probably the important phase where you are at now as you're developing your concept note and thinking through your theory of change, and also thinking about the innovation you're presenting, is trying to establish what you already know about about the particular intervention and its contribution to the field. And what do you think you can uniquely offer by doing this piece of work? Next slide. So therefore, when we think about designing and implement, and I see this as not just an evaluation, but rather we see it as implementation research, is really thinking about how we marry our methods to the needs. And often it's also, as I said, it's a participatory process where we bring the implementation team into thinking about what would be the best methods for the research as well. So the learning questions are incredibly important, or the research questions. As I've said, what is already known and what are the gaps? So what do you want to fill the gaps in knowledge that this particular program can then, give us more information about. How will the project address these gaps, and what are we hoping to achieve? So your theory of change and mapping this out well is incredibly important. And we've also got to think about what is feasible to study, firstly, in the given time that's available. And I'm not quite sure, but I think an innovation grant is 3 years, if I'm correct, and we can clarify that. And what resources is available to do the kind of research that we're hoping to do. And so if we're thinking about a research design, we've got to be thinking about your question. So what is the question that you have, and what would be the most suited design to answer that research question? So an impact evaluation is normally answered through an RCT, and that tells us, what impact the project has. So for instance, if we're thinking about a community-based intervention and you want to understand whether in fact your community-based intervention is having an effect on the experience of violence by women and girls in that particular community, then in that particular study, if you're wanting to really rigorously evaluate this, then you want to do an RCT where you have intervention and control communities, and it becomes very complicated. But there's also other ways to establish whether your program works, and therefore operations research is another way to do that. There's also participatory action research and participatory ways of establishing whether a program works or not. There's also CAP surveys that tells you whether your intervention, if you're particularly thinking about shifting norms, whether in fact you're able to shift norms by implementing the particular program that you're implementing. Shall we move on? Therefore, I think I want to reiterate that who decides what kind of research is really important, that it's not just the research team, that we come in and work with the implementation team together with the senior technical advisors who are part of the team. So the implementation consortium, the research consortium, working with the implementers, work together to establish the research, what research will be carried out, as well as then jointly thinking about what would be the best methods to implement. But feasibility of a particular study is of critical importance depending on the context that you are working in. Next slide. If you're thinking about program impact, so if we're wanting to establish whether in fact your program has an impact, the best way to do that, and you'll see here in this particular diagram, it would mean that you do some kind of survey or baseline assessment before the program start, and you do another assessment at the end after the program has ended. That would give you an idea of whether your program is making a difference. However, if you have the best way to do this is to have a comparison group where there's no program being implemented for that period of time in a very different community. Or if you're thinking of schools, it could be a few schools have the program implemented, while others don't have the program implemented, and you look at the outcomes. So then you can compare whether your program's actually making the difference. And that gives you a good understanding. If you don't have a comparison group, you're not that entirely sure whether in fact the differences you're seeing from the start of the program to the end has been based on the program itself, because there could be other factors that could also have influenced outcomes in that particular community. So that's really important if you're thinking about how programs are evaluated, and whether if the interest is looking at the impact of the particular program. Mary, did you want to take over, or do you want me to just continue?
No, I'm sure I'm happy to come in.
To come in?
Sure.
Okay, sure. You can take over. Do you want to take over?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Mary Ellsberg, and I'm the director of the Global Women's Institute, which is the lead organization in the research consortium. We work very closely with Shanaz and the other organizations that she mentioned already, and very closely, of course, with the implementation consortium and all of the grantees to develop the research that accompanies these programs, and to really try to together produce the evidence that shows how effective these programs are. I'll just say a few words about the research objective. Shanaz already gave you the beginning of this, but we start with basically what I think in practice-based learning we often call a learning objective. We call them, a learning question, and we call them research objectives. And basically, it's the overall understanding of what you're trying to learn from this. And each objective will have some specific questions that come with it. So let's go to the next slide, please. So an example of what we might want to do with one of these projects would be to understand the impact of a prevention program on the rates of violence that in communities that participate in the program compared to communities that don't participate in the program. So basically what we're looking at, if we're looking at the impact, we are talking about, does violence actually go down in the communities where the program is happening? That's what we mean by impact on prevention. Next slide, please. So there are three main ways that we would be looking at that. And Shanaz already mentioned them. There's experimental, what we call quasi-experimental, and non-experimental. And each one of these kinds of designs has pros and cons, and they will they tell us different things, and it has to do with which one we choose, really has to do with what it is we want to find out, what stage the program is in already, and also, of course, our resources. So let's go to the experimental one. This is often called a randomized controlled trial or a cluster randomized controlled trial. You will have probably heard both of those. And basically what makes them experimental is that you choose randomly specific communities or individuals that receive the intervention and another group that don't receive it. Now, we are trying to do things in a feminist and ethical way. So we're not, if we know that something is effective, we're not going to deny it to a community just so that we can have a control. What we usually do is have some kind of what we call a light version of it, or a delayed intervention, so that after we've done the study, we continue to work with the control communities so that they also get some benefit from this. These experimental designs are considered the most rigorous, but they're not always easy to do. And oh dear, am I still there? Yes, I'm sorry, my computer seems to be rebooting suddenly.
You still
You're
here,
there.
Mary?
We
We
hear
can hear
you.
you.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. Next slide, please. So a quasi-experimental design would be in the case where it's not possible to randomize which communities get the intervention and which ones don't. And that might happen particularly because there's just really not capacity to when you randomize, you might have one community, in one corner of a county, and then the next intervention community could be at the other end of the county. And it could be that a small organization just does not have the capacity to have an intervention that is kind of in random spots throughout a region. It's just not possible, or maybe it's already been designed in such a way that you already know where your communities are going to be, the intervention is going to be. In those cases, you can't randomize the assignment of the communities to control and to intervention. So then you try to find communities that are similar to your intervention communities, in every way you possibly can, including the amount of violence that's there. And then you use those as a comparison. You can't be absolutely sure that at the end of this, if you have less violence in the intervention communities than in the comparison groups, you can't say for certain whether it's your program that created the decrease in violence, because you haven't randomized. So there's you have some loss of rigor in this in terms of whether, how valid your evidence is, but sometimes that's all you can really do, and it still gives important evidence. Next slide. In those cases, when you can't do any kind of randomization or have a comparison, that's when we have a non-experimental design. And that might be that usually will not give us enough information to say that violence decreased because of our intervention or our program, but they can give you a lot of information about process and other kinds of learning. So for example, you might look at what are the activities or the components that seem to be most useful. Now we're not using the word of effectiveness, but we're saying what seems to be the most useful improving communication between couples in a couples program, or comparing a few different types of ways of intervening. For example, using online chatbots compared to direct programs where you're directly giving education to a community, and which of those is more acceptable or more feasible. So those are other kinds of important research, and we will be using those in some cases when it's more appropriate. And what makes it more appropriate is, one, as I said, the ability to actually have a control or a comparison group and the resources to do that. But again, also all these other questions that we would go through, which is really what is the question your program needs to answer? What are you actually measuring? How sure do you need to be? And some of these other issues, like, has the program already started? If that's happened, you can't easily do, for example, a baseline, because the baseline has to be done before you can start your intervention. So there are a lot of issues, and we would discuss those all together in the co-design process, and that's part of the work between the research consortium and the national research team and the grantees and the the implementation consortium. So jointly we decide what it is most important and most feasible to study with this particular kind of project. Next slide, please. One last issue that we do want to mention is we want to make sure that the work we do is ethical and safe, that we're not putting anybody at risk when we do this research, particularly survivors of violence who might find themselves facing retaliation or re-victimization or re-trauma as a result of talking about their experiences of violence. So we just want to assure you that these are issues that we take very seriously, and we would be discussing those also with the grantees to make sure that anybody we include in the research has absolute, they have the information they need to be able to consent to the process, that we keep privacy and confidentiality foremost in everything we do, and making sure that both the participants and the researchers are kept safe throughout the process and are not subject to any additional risks. And all of this, because there have been so many lapses by researchers in the past doing unethical or unsafe practices, now every country in the world and all of our universities have very rigorous standards in place, and there are ethical review boards that we would have to present and get approval from, both at a national level and also from our universities, UCT or GW or Johns Hopkins. We all have institutional review boards. So we mention this because it adds some time to the process of being able to implement a project. So doing a project in the context of research is a little different than just getting funding to do your program, because you're doing it, it all has to be approved within the standards of safety. And you have to do things like plan the baseline before you can start your implementation. All of that makes it, especially the inception period and the planning, more lengthy and more complicated as well. And it can take a few months to get a very detailed protocol approved by an IRB, which is the name of the ethical review boards, because they want to go through everything. They look at the tools, they look at the translation of the tools that you're using to collect information. They look at your informed consent procedures. They want to know everything about where the data are going to be stored, and how to make sure that nobody can have access to it, and then all of these other safety issues. So we want you to know from the very beginning that you'll be working very closely with us, and which we look forward to. And it'll be a little different if you haven't done research before. On the other hand, what's exciting about this program is that the work that you do is going to produce evidence that will improve policies, that will create best practices, and that we hope will show that it is possible to prevent violence in a variety of different ways, in different contexts, and in different groups. And all of this will actually increase investment and ensure that there are more funds available afterwards for doing these kinds of important programming. I think that's the last slide. Just to say also, on the website of the Global Women's Institute, we have several resources available to understand better what the research process is like. And we even have, and these are 3 of them, and you can find them on the Global Women's Institute website. But we also have, for example, the program on the side, the Research Monitoring and Evaluation Manual, is part of a self-paced course called building GBV evidence. And this is particularly for conflict-affected populations, but it has a lot of information about M&E that we think would be really useful for you. And these are free courses that you're all invited to register and take, and we think they would be super useful for you as we continue this partnership into learning and building evidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary, Shanaz, and Tina, for the presentations. Right on time for our half an hour Q&A. We have 31 minutes for us to engage with each other. I know there has been some questions sent in the Q&A, and I know we have colleagues who have been answering some of those. And I also see there is others that are not yet answered. So Becky, do you want to monitor and start asking people to raise their hands and pose the question? And I would rather we start with the ones that are relating to the presentations for today, so that then we focus on those, and the others around the application process, eligibility, we can probably respond by email if we don't have time by the end of the webinar. But if we answer the ones relating to research and effective programming, and we still have some time, then we can take the others that relate to the process of application.
Great. Thanks, Anne. Yeah, so there are several questions still in the Q&A. If colleagues from the presenting team, Teresa, Tina, Shanaz, Mary, if you could please keep reviewing those comments in the Q&A and answering them as we go. I'll take questions via raised hands. So as Anne says, please raise your hand if you have a question. Please, given this is the technical webinar, please try and ensure that your questions are related to the kind of technical content of the webinar. As Anne says, if you have questions about eligibility, how to apply, things like that, please do email them to us. because that was the content of last week's webinar. But for now, I will take hands that are raised. Please raise your hand if you have a question. I'll go to Ryder first. Please unmute yourself. You should now be able to unmute yourself and ask your question. Thanks.
Hello, thank you so much for this excellent and very informative webinar. I've been disseminating news about the call widely. I'm a part-time PhD student at Bath University and a part-time consultant on gender empowerment and women's equality with a focus on SGBV. I have two questions really. The first is in terms of the extremely important research, component of the call. Are there any Arab world or Global South top tier institutes that are part of this, sort of partnership, research partnership? Because we know, for example, the Arab Council for the Social Sciences and other top-tier institutes do exist. And the translation into Arabic and then all the connotations, the sociocultural connotations sometimes are lost in translation. And the second is, do you, upon submission of the concept notes, do what I've seen in other calls that we've been part of and I've submitted to as an independent consultant, matchmake? So matchmake and complement the skills and the capacities to create a consortium within these regions. And thank you very, very much again, both for the call and for these enlightening webinars.
Thank you, Raida. So, Rebecca, do you want to take a few or do we want to answer as they go?
I think probably easier to answer as we go. So yeah,
All right. Mary or Shanaz?
I
Yeah.
can say something about
Mary.
Yeah. Sure, I'm happy to say something about the Research Institute. So in our network of resource partners, we have partners in all of the countries that FCDO, or nearly all of the countries that FCDO is working in. I would say we have less in the MENA region, and if a project is approved in a country where there are not partners already, we would definitely work with the grantee to choose the top tier and the most appropriate institution. And we are very willing to discuss this in any case. We'd be working with the grantee. We have some researchers who are part of our network already, but we are always happy to hear more recommendations and make sure that we get the best partner.
Great, thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Mary. Did that answer both parts of your questions, Raida, or?
The second leg, which is the matchmaking between to complement, sort of create consortia within regions that I've seen elsewhere upon submission of the concept mode, so that the effort isn't lost and you keep that local capacity. If you could just address that in thank you.
Thanks very much. Anne, do you want to come in and take that one?
About matchmaking partners?
Matchmaking partners, yeah, sort of appropriate partners and in certain regions.
No, in terms of the application process, we let partners determine who they want to partner with for the intervention. So, for instance, if it's in Syria and groups there want to partner, get together, as long as it's a women-led women's rights organization that's in the lead for innovation, they can partner with other actors. And then what we do is once that is selected for award of a grant, that is where now they are matched, paired with a research partner. So, but at the point of application, that's the decision of the applying organization in terms of who they want to partner with.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'll mute now. Thanks again.
Okay.
Great, thanks, Ryder. Okay, I'll move on to the next hand. I've got Sama Please do unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, everyone. My question is about if we are trying to address state violence, and in that sense, the means and the engagement will not be maybe with the community on the ground. It will be more on international forums or engagement with different mechanisms related to women rights. Is it still something that the program might be interested in funding? Here, I'm talking more about capacity building for advocacy, women groups, victims of torture and enforced disappearance, who might not be inside the country and might be in other countries around the world. So capacity building, legal advocacy, and this kind of activities, is it still part of the focus of this grant? Thank you so much.
I could take that, Becky. So the focus of this particular round, it's the second round of application of concept notes for innovation grants. We have three thematic areas, and one of which is addressing violence prevention in humanitarian context. So it could be in a protracted crisis, and so working to prevent violence in those contexts. And again, in last week's seminar, we spoke about looking at prevention from the continuum of not just stopping violence before it happens, but also preventing violence from recurring, repeated incidents of violence, and also the response services. So really, it so that's one of the thematic areas we are focusing on. The next one is working on the intersection between violence against women and climate change. That's the second one. And the third one is technology facilitated gender based violence. So if you're working with women human rights defenders and you think any of those areas of thematic areas would fit in your area of work, then you're open to apply. So that's a decision you'd have to make for yourselves after you look at the thematic areas.
Great. Thanks so much, Anne. Okay, the next hand I've got is Nadia. Please do come in and ask your question.
Hi, thank you for this webinar. Maybe because we didn't I didn't attend the previous webinars, so I'm taking this chance today. I have two questions. The first one is about, for example, the focus areas. Shall we? I mean, when we are going to apply for example, for this grant, is it going to be like we have to work on the three focus areas, or we can choose one of them? Or this is a question. The second one is if we are in a consortium, for example, and there is INGO and a civil society organization. If all of us are women rights organizations, can the lead organization be the international NGO, or it's supposed to be the civil society organization? Thank you.
I can respond to that. Thank you so much, Nadia. So for the innovation grants, they are aimed at supporting women-led organizations. And it's okay if you're able to partner with an international organization, but the leadership should be the women rights organization. It's aimed at strengthening the capacity and ensuring that sufficient funds also go to the women rights organizations. And back to your question on the thematic focus, those are the three thematic areas. And if it's going to be an innovation that is going to be evaluated, you might consider focusing on one area as as the main focus with some of the additional. You do not have to apply to the three thematic areas, because that will be too much for 3 years and for the limited amount of funding. I hope I still see your hand up. Do
Yes.
you have an additional?
Yeah, no, it's the same question, the first question. I mean, you said it's supposed to be a women rights organization. I mean, if both the local and the international were women human rights organizations and working towards the same thing, can the international NGO be the lead in that? They are also women human rights organization.
So thanks for clarifying. For the innovation grants, we are looking at the local women rights organizations being the lead applicants for those reasons that I've spoken about. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I'll move on to the next hand. I've got Gulnagar. Please do unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for this webinar, the first and the second, this one. It was great. I have some question. The first question, I think there is 3 grant fund or 2, because in the first webinar, it said that it is a skill up grant fund and innovation grant fund. My second question is, can local NGO also apply for this project, or it is only the refugee lead organization? And third question is that, can we get support from you, I mean, from the organization which have been announced the grant fund, like a consultant? Because what I understood from these webinars is that it is like a research. We have to do a research, which means we have to find a strategy, a technique to fight against the violence for the women and girls or children. If it is so, I mean, if it is only the research and not the implementation part, or it is a research, means to find a problem and then find a strategy for it and then implement it to resolve that issue, that problem. My fourth question, I think. But or what I understood, or there is like you give the like a policy or a procedure, like capacity building, that we are going to, the applicant going to implement that again for the purpose to reduce the violence and enhance the independency. So what I mean, when there are the skilled people, the aware people, the people with the capacity, with the talent, I think on those families and communities, the violence will be minimum or at the least reduced. So these are my questions. If you please kindly reply it. Thank you.
I can take the first one about the type of grant. So we, as a program, we focus on both innovation and scale. But for this particular window that we are seeking concept notes, it's for the innovation projects. So if you want to apply, then the eligibility criteria is been shared on the links in the Q&A, and we also shared it last week. So we are applying for an innovation grant to focus on any of those 3 thematic areas. I think your second question was around can local organizations apply? Yes, if you're local women-led women's rights organizations, majority of the people in the leadership are women, then you can apply. And the third one, I wasn't sure I understood whether it's asking about capacity for research or Shanaz, did you get that one? Because I thought it was more oriented towards research.
Yeah, it is about research, but also
Consultant,
perhaps
a
you can
support.
clarify. Yeah.
It is like to have, can we have a support person, a consultant from your side to beside the webinars to a bit guide us what we need to do? The question was that.
So in terms of the research will not be conducted by the implementing organization. You will be allocated a research partner to work alongside you to conduct the research. So there will be a technical research team that will be working alongside you. So it's not expected that the grantee will be doing the research themselves. Does that answer your question?
Just to clear it, yeah. So it means we, the applicant who will be selected, need to implement the project, but they're not. Okay, then there is no need that they contact a research, but the research will be done from other party.
Exactly, and from another pot of money. So the budget you have, you won't be budgeting for research. You will be working with a research team that will be doing the research. It will be funded through another mechanism.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Great.
Thanks, Shanaz. Thanks, Anne. Shina, I'll go to you next. Please do come in and ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon or evening. My name is Shina. I'm based here in Kenya, and I work for Somali Services, Family Services, sorry. And my question actually was something integrated with our organization. We're not exactly always focusing on gender-based violence. Yes, we've done implementation in Somalia on gender-based violence, but our organization isn't only mainly focusing on that. So does that also mean that you're still part of the qualification or no? That was my question.
Thanks, Shina. I'm really sorry. You were breaking up a little bit, and I don't know. I didn't catch all of that. I don't know if Anne or anyone else managed to hear it a bit better. We might need to ask you to repeat it or just to type it in the chat if possible.
I can repeat my question.
Yeah, please do try once more.
Okay. So my question was, the organization that we're in, we don't mainly focus on only gender-based violence or women's rights. Our organization also focuses on other implementations in Somalia. So are we still part of a qualification because we have done one implementation in Somalia for gender-based violence?
Okay, I had that, Becky. So if your organization has implemented previous projects on gender-based violence, you have track record, because one of the questions you're asking in the concept note is for you to demonstrate you have done work in this area. So you can apply if you have, but if you haven't done any work in the past and this is the first time you want to start, then that might be, you may be ineligible.
All right, great. Thank you so much for answering that. Yes, we do have a track record for gender-based violence. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Shina. Okay, I'll go to Stephen next. Please do come in and ask your question.
Thank you so much for this second webinar. I was in the first, however, I did not receive the materials, but I'll do the text as you have stated in one of the response to a question that was asked. So my question is on when you talk about at scale, do we really mean, for example, if you're working in one county out of 47, do you mean the expansion of the counties? And since we are bringing in the aspect of research, in terms of control, controls population size. Will you be interested probably to offer, or rather the research should be or could be based on an existing project that is currently going on, so that we can now incorporate new ideas in what works true and also the existing project and compare. So basically, the research component will be coming in to establish in order to finance the control population. Is it something that you're welcoming? Also, the other part of the question is on advocacy. I've had severally the speakers mentioning something to do with advocacy. So first of all, you could correct my mindset. Probably I had it wrong. Does it mean that you're not interested, does it mean that what works true is not interested in doing policy change or policy formulation within the 3 years in terms of financing the process? Also, I've heard that capacity building for advocacy. Probably could clarify, is it something that what works too is not mainly going to focus on capacity building, for example, girls and women on issues of advocacy? And then lastly, can a research question be based on policy implementation, whether a policy is being implemented, at what level has it been implemented? Is that something that probably what works to could focus it to? Thank you so much.
Mary and Shanaz, do you want to touch on the research aspects of the question, and we can handle the rest? I'm prioritizing those.
Mary, do you want to take the question?
I think we both all need to weigh in on this. I think it's a really important research question, but it's so from our perspective, we'd be very happy to look into it. But I think probably Anne's team or Tina can speak more to whether that would be considered a priority within these innovation, you know, as a goal or an intervention for these innovation grants.
So, sorry.
Go
I do
ahead,
want
Tina.
thanks for that question. Maybe just to put everything into context, many people call certain actions different names: advocacy, community mobilization, awareness raising. But I would like to really understand what is your technical or thematic focus on. And if your work, if you look at the work for the innovation grant here, it's only 3 years. If you're going to focus mainly on policy change because you work on law change or whatever you call it, it might be really difficult because you do not have so much power to get the government pass policies and implement them within a limited time frame. So if your work is focused on the prevention component, as we've discussed, and maybe if what you're referring to in your program as advocacy is working towards prevention or stopping occurrence of violence as we've described, and it's meeting the eligibility criteria here, maybe that could also be considered. I would recommend that you go back to the eligibility criteria and review and see how that particular program of yours is really connected to the innovation. And maybe just to pose another question, what would you put your finger on to call as innovation within that particular program that you're describing? Would you be able to
Yeah,
just
I can also quickly come in here before he answers that, Tina. So it's what works does have advocacy. We call it external engagement and influencing, and who the selected partners will have to develop what we call the gender political economy analysis, out of which they will develop an advocacy strategy. But the advocacy strategy will be based on the project they will be implementing. So if you're implementing a project on prevention and then the research is done, so this whole advocacy work and policy influencing will be based on that study and the findings that are emanating from that. So we do that, just to clarify that component that you asked. And I know we have 4 more minutes, so I don't know whether we want to take one more or question before we can finalize.
I think we probably have time for one more, and hopefully the final 5 questions in the Q&A will also be able to be responded to in that time. So I'll take just one more from Fatma. Please do come in and ask your question. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you very much for this informative webinar. I have a couple of questions. One is particularly maybe related to understanding whether we would be eligible to apply for this call or not. My name is Fatma Ibrahim. I am the director of an organization that works on combating sexual and gender-based violence in Arabic-speaking countries. We identify as youth-led, women-led feminist organization, and we try to work from a grassroots perspective while using innovative tools to address gender-based violence and sexual violence in our region. And when we say innovative, we try to find new ways to work on issues that have been under exploring for a long time, but with no real effect and no real change happening. So we try to find innovative ways to do it differently from a local and grassroots perspective. I wonder, so one of the things we do is providing sex education through digital platforms and tools, allowing to break geographic barriers and allowing also to do so in a bold way that we wouldn't be able to do if we do this work in physical format. So we can do positive, inclusive, queer inclusive, and this like inclusive in several ways, sex education in Arabic, and reach as many people from our community as possible through these digital tools in a safe way as well for people who are attending these programs that we provide. Would that fit within the technology, what's it called? Sorry, technology, I took a note down. Facilitated GBV interventions, or that wouldn't be the case? That's my first question. The second question is related to, you frequently said that you're looking for innovative ideas, bold ideas, large scope or scale. However, I do feel that this type of interventions are mostly done by youth-led activists and grassroots activists or groups that may not have the capacity for all the requirements of this call. So while they have the reach and they have the tools and they have the theory of a change that they're working with, but they might not be able to implement this project according to all of these requirements of this goal. So would some of the grant available be directed or dedicated to the capacity building of these groups in order to be able to do the innovative work that they have been doing or they want to do? And they probably have also evidence of impact from previous interventions that they've conducted. Would that be part of the outcomes, for example, of the call? Thank you.
We are at time, and I'll quickly say that please refer to the guidance note. We spoke extensively last week and answered a lot of questions on eligibility. And then once you look at the guidance note, you will be able to determine whether you can apply or not. And really, I would refer everyone to just read up on the guidance note. If you have previous evidence that you've generated and you want to test that further, again, you're welcome to apply. I have seen a lot of comments about sharing the webinar. We will be sharing the webinar to all the people who attended. We did share last week's, and if you haven't received it, unfortunately, we don't know why, but we are happy to, if you had registered and attended, we'll be happy to share it again with you. So I really want to bring us to a close and to thank our panelists and to thank all of you for the interest. I know some of you it's late, others it's early, depending on where you are, others it's midday. But thank you for finding time to engage with us. We have an FAQ document that we are updating very regularly on the website links. And if you have any further questions, please engage with us on the www.info@rescue. We've also posted it here. And also, I'm told that last session is now on YouTube. My colleague has shared the YouTube link there. So feel free to engage with us, to continue asking our questions, and we'll be able to come back to you on the topics that we've discussed today. So really, I want to bring us to a close at this point and to thank everyone.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.